This CBS News special report is part of our continuing coverage of 9/11, the day that changed America. From Ground Zero in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good day again. Ground Zero. 1 year ago, on this spot, the worst for most of us in the inconceivable had happened. The Twin Towers had fallen and transformed by the alchemy of destruction into a vast flaming ruin. Today we mourn, we remember, we honor, and we look ahead on this first anniversary of 9/11, the day that changed America. It's just past midday here in Lower Manhattan, where in the past few hours we have witnessed ceremonies marking events and remembering the victims of the attack on America 1 year ago. This half hour in our continuing CBS News coverage of this 9/11 anniversary, we will recap the Ground Zero ceremonies and other ceremonies of the day so far at the rebuilt Pentagon, as well as here at Ground Zero. We'll have reports on the status of security around the country, which remains officially under a code orange, quote, high alert for possible terrorist attack. We'll give you an overview of the president's busy day. And CBS News national correspondent Bob Sheeper will assess the mood on Capitol Hill, which may have been the intended target of the hijackers on the United Airlines jet that was crashed in Pennsylvania, thanks to the work of heroes on board that plane. And you'll hear the personal stories of some of our CBS News colleagues, what they saw and heard and thought as they covered the events of that chaotic, terrible day. Now, here's some of what we have coming up later this afternoon and evening. In just about a half hour, President Bush will be arriving in Shanksville, Pennsylvania to meet with families and lay a wreath honoring the dead of United Flight 93. At our last report, the President's helicopter was coming down at the site in Pennsylvania. At about 4:55 Eastern Time today, that'd be 3:55, of course, in the Central Time Zone, the President will arrive for ceremonies here at Ground Zero. Shortly after 7 p.m. Eastern Time this evening, there will be a sunset ceremony at the Spear Memorial in Battery Park, just south of here. And at 9 Eastern Time tonight, President Bush will address the nation from Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Now, joining me now, and for the next few hours, is my friend, longtime colleague and 60 Minutes correspondent, Ed Bradley. Ed?
Dan, sad day, but good to be here with you. I'm reminded of the historian Joseph Ellis said last week that the day may have passed, but September 11th is not over. It continues, and you're really very aware of that being here today.
Not over, not nearly over. Now let's go to CBS News correspondent Bob Gore, who's reporting live from Reagan National Airport, just outside the Capitol. Bob?
Well, Dan, the effects of last September 11th are clearly being felt all across America today in aviation. Airports like Reagan National here are virtually empty. We've got reports from Chicago and Atlanta and in Dallas. People just didn't decide to fly today. They stayed home. Scores of flights have been canceled. Thousands of passengers stayed home for a number of reasons. Some are afraid, some just wanted to reflect on the day, but in any case, air travel is down precipitously. We're told here in Washington, as many as 70 flights have been canceled. Here at Reagan National, some 40% of the passenger load, the normal passenger load, is not showing up today. There is one potential security problem that the authorities are investigating at this hour. It involves Northwest Flight 979. This is a flight that took off this morning from Memphis bound for Las Vegas. Apparently, there was the report of at least one suspicious passenger on board. The pilots didn't want to take any chances. They diverted and landed the plane safely in Fort Smith, Arkansas. We're told that all the passengers now have been taken off the plane, and the FBI has at least one person in custody. Now, federal authorities caution us that this very likely will turn out to be nothing, but it does illustrate just what a hair-trigger approach we have to security now. Since last September 11th, there have been more than 500 such incidents, many of them escorted by fighter jets.
I didn't hear that. Bob Orr reporting live from Reagan National Airport outside Washington. We take you now to the Pentagon, where CBS News national security correspondent David Martin has an update on the latest Code Orange terror alert and the U.S. military's readiness. David, what is the situation at this hour?
Well, Dan, there are two situations which are being investigated. One is overseas in Europe, where a number of American embassies and consulates have received letters containing a white powder, raising the obvious anthrax scare. The embassies have been closed, the mailrooms have been closed, and they are in the process of testing the powder to see what it really is. But that has just come to our attention in the last 30 minutes, and that is being investigated. Earlier today, we reported on a Liberian container ship that had been stopped in the port of New York by the Coast Guard and searched, and they got some traces of radioactive material on some of their meters. They have taken that ship 6 miles out to sea, and both FBI and intelligence officials tell us that that remains a suspicious ship. The Coast Guard had searched it in the first place because they had an intelligence tip that that kind of ship might be used to smuggle contraband into the United States. Its papers were not in order. The Coast Guard thought they heard the sound of stowaways hiding someplace in the cargo hold, and one of their crew members is a person who has tried before to enter the United States and been turned away. The important point, though, is as of this moment, all subsequent tests for radioactive material have proved inconclusive, but they are still regarding this as a suspicious ship. They have it 6 miles out to sea where it is being shipped, where it is being inspected by Department of Energy experts.
Well, David, question. We know that a lot of ships fly under the Liberian flag. Do we know from where this ship came to New York Harbor?
We know its last port of call, which was Valencia, Spain, and New York is its first port of call here in the United States.
Well, David, we'll be monitoring this story as it develops, if it develops, during the day. This day's observances at the White House began just after midnight. President Bush, we're told, was up early to start a whirlwind day and night of appearances and speeches. CBS News White House correspondent Bill Plante joins us now with more about the president's busy schedule. Bill?
Well, Dan, for the White House and for the president, this was a day of tribute and memory, and also a day of symbolism. It began, as you said, just after midnight, when the flag, which flies above the White House, was lowered to half-staff in honor of all the dead in Washington, in New York, and in Pennsylvania. And then first thing this morning, the president and first lady set out to go to church at St. John's just across the park from the White House for a service of prayer and remembrance. And then at exactly 8:46 this morning Eastern Time, when the first plane hit the first tower, the president, the White House staff gathered on the south lawn of the White House, looking toward the monuments and the Pentagon. They observed a moment of silence. Later at the Pentagon, Mr. Bush gave one of only 2 speeches that he'll give today. The other, of course, is the address to the nation tonight. And in that speech, the president praised the spirit which rebuilt the building, and the spirit which drives the U.S. military and keeps the nation behind the cause at hand. And soon, he'll be in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and then later this afternoon in New York at Ground Zero. And at Ground Zero, the president will leave a commemorative plaque. The plaque is emblazoned with the presidential seal, and it reads as follows: "In memory of the events of September 11, 2001, every life taken here, every act of valor performed here, the nation holds in honored memory. September 11, 2002, George Bush." Now, even though the president isn't speaking at the 2 events this afternoon, the symbolism of both is very important as part of the White House campaign to build support for action against Saddam Hussein. Tonight, when he does speak, it'll be very brief. We're told only 6 or 7 minutes. There'll be no mention of Iraq. He'll talk about liberty and freedom. But as one White House official told us, you can read liberty and freedom forward as well as back. In the New York Times today, Mr. Bush has an article, and he writes that he'll speak tonight about what the nation has lost, what we have discovered about ourselves, and what lies ahead. And in that article, Mr. Bush says it's necessary to confront the growing threat of regimes that support terror and seek weapons of mass destruction. He says the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic. That, of course, is preparing the ground for the speech that he will give tomorrow to the United Nations, where he will urge them to push for action against Saddam Hussein, even if there is no direct evidence connecting him to 9/11. And
Bill Plante reporting live from the White House. A program note, CBS News will, of course, carry the president's address before the United Nations about Iraq tomorrow. That will be after we carry tonight the president's live address to the nation. Now, the president's helicopter has arrived in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where later this afternoon the president will be laying a wreath, and we will return shortly for those ceremonies. And I want to remind again that the names and, where available, photographs of every victim of the Pentagon and the Pennsylvania crash will eventually be carried on the bottom of your screen here on CBS. Now, the sun had barely risen on this still young day when emotional ceremonies began back here at the pit at Ground Zero, with even more to follow. CBS's Jon Frankel is here with the sights, the sounds, and the words of remembrance. John?
Dan, there is still a long line of friends and family members making their way into the pit to pay their respects following a morning of raw emotion.
Bagpipes and drums, a procession of pride and pain. The tone today is clear as the images of yesterday. It is about people. Thousands gathered at this space to remember the void they see and feel.
Again today, we are a nation that mourns. Again today, we take into our hearts and minds those who perished on this site 1 year ago.
The terrifying sounds of a year ago at 8:46 were drowned out today by a moment of silence. Then names of those lost.
Edelmiro Abad, Maria Rose.
2,801 names, too often
Andrew
from the
Anthony
same
Abad.
family.
Joseph Angelini, Jr.
Joseph Angelini Sr.
Abraham Lincoln's words, which sought to bring comfort to a divided nation, were echoed today for the same nation united in mourning.
The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
Michelle Renee Bratton.
Patricia Brout.
The chain of names was broken for a second moment of silence and the words of a grieving daughter.
You were the best father I could ever ask for. I miss you, and I hope you didn't hurt too much.
Friends and family walked down the same ramp on which the remains of many loved ones were carried out. At a circle of honor, petals, prayers, and portraits left a striking contrast to the jagged concrete surroundings. This morning's ceremony concluded with an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Which here today voiced this country's defiance for the damage done.
It took about 2.5 hours to read the names of those lost. There's no telling how long it will take to heal the wounds. Dan?
Jon Frankel reporting live from here at Ground Zero. Well, President Bush, as we said, has arrived in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and these are the moments before the president will lay a wreath there. And he also will speak and shake hands for quite a long while in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, once these ceremonies get underway. You know, Ed Bradley, there's been not a lot, but some murmuring of, well, we forgot about what happened in Pennsylvania. We've concentrated so much on the tremendous loss of life at Ground Zero and at the Pentagon.
Well, I think it's because there was so much visible here at the World Trade Center, as well as visible at the Pentagon. The damage in Pennsylvania, the thing that struck me in reading the Jerry Longman's book, who we'll be talking to later in this broadcast, that the first people on the scene went to look for this plane. They had seen the plane fly overhead. They knew that a plane had crashed because they heard it. And they got there and they didn't see a plane because it had burrowed so deeply into the ground.
Then in that piece of ground is exactly where the President and First Lady Laura Bush are walking to at the moment, what's called the impact area. The President will arrive there, as he does now, to applause. There'll be the wreath-laying ceremony, then a moment of silence, and then the bugler will play echo taps.
We ask that you bow your heads and your hearts with us. God's best to you, President Bush. We love you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will bless them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore.
And you, Son of Man, be not afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words. Though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit upon scorpions, be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
His truth is marching on. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. and dance. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel writ in burnished rows of steel. As he deal with my contemner, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
After the chorale has sung the battle hymn of the Republic, the President and First Lady will now proceed to offer their condolences and the condolences of a grateful nation to the gathered family members of Flight 93. There are no plans for the President to speak here. He's going to take his time here. He'll be here for a while. Hattie Kaufman is there in Pennsylvania. Hattie?
Dan, as you say, the President is not going to make any public speech. He did not attend the memorial here this morning, instead choosing to have this private time with family members of those who lost lives on Flight 93. You know, the valor of those on board that flight has almost taken on mythical or legendary status in America, and maybe rightly so, because of all the horror on September 11th. It's one story that ended with triumph. They stopped the hijackers. Dan?
Hattie Kaufman on the scene as the President offers his condolences. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of 9/11, the day that changed America. Dan Rather with Ed Bradley here at Ground Zero in New York. And of course, we'll be returning to Shanksville, Pennsylvania for the pictures of the President shaking hands, having a word with each family member of those who died when the plane crashed there. John Roberts, our senior White House correspondent, is here in New York with us today. John, it was obvious that the President was moved when they began singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and near the end, he was mouthing some of the words himself.
Dan, the president not speaking there at Shanksville, but certainly he has spoke often of what happened aboard United Airlines Flight 93, describing it as the first counterattack of the first battle of the 21st century. He has often said in speeches that the nation owes those people, those 40 people on board the aircraft, a debt of gratitude for their selfless sacrifice. He says that they saw a cause that was greater than themselves, took control, and drove that plane into the ground. It's part of what he calls a new spirit of America that was demonstrated in the skies, not just over America, but around the world several times after. Particularly, I recall the case of the alleged shoe bomber, Richard Reed. As he was trying to light the wick that was protruding from his shoe, he was tackled by a couple of flight attendants and a number of passengers who trussed him up and actually sedated him. Brought that episode under control long enough that they could get the plane onto the ground and get him into custody. And certainly the president, going back all the way to his address to Congress on September 20th, has recognized the now immortal words of Todd Beamer, who said, "Let's roll," when the passengers were preparing to take control of the plane. And if you'll recall that night, he recognized Todd's wife, Lisa Beamer, who has really come to symbolize that spirit of fighting back, that indefatigable spirit of America that says, you don't let them get you down, you fight back. It's a story that the president often likes to talk about across the country at every event that he's at, about the heroism and self-sacrifice in the face of evil, death, and destruction, how brave people who knew they were going to die were resolved to that fact, could telephone loved ones, say their goodbyes, tell them one last time, I love you, and then take on the terrorists. And the president has also said many times, how many lives did those 40 people save? We may never know. If we are to believe suspected al-Qaeda operatives who were recently interviewed by Arab TV, perhaps it was the thousands of people who work at the Capitol building who were in the gun sights of the terrorists. Or if we listen to another al-Qaeda operative, Abu Zubaydah, it was the White House that it was in the gun sights. But certainly, Dan, the one lesson that this has taught us all, I think, was reflected in the words of the wife of the pilot of Flight 93, Sandy Dahl, who this morning said, the lesson of 9/11 is that life is short. There is no time for hatred. Dan?
John Roberts, John, is it or is it not generally accepted now on the basis of the new information that has been gathered that the intention was to crash the plane that went down in Pennsylvania? The intention was to crash it into the Capitol.
Well, that's the information, Dan, that came to us from the two al-Qaeda operatives who were recently interviewed by Al Jazeera television. But you might remember that earlier this year, Abu Zubaydah, who is a top al-Qaeda operative who has been talking with the FBI, said that the initial target was the White House. It may be that we never know what the target was. And certainly, if you're a terrorist, you're in the sky, you're flying at 500 miles an hour, you could make the case that the Capitol building is an easier target to hit. It's much more visible right there at the end of the mall. It's a very powerful symbol of American democracy and power. But if you were trying to cut off the head of the United States government, the more powerful symbol is the White House. Though when you fly into Washington, as many people do every year, you try to find the White House buried in amongst the trees on Pennsylvania Avenue. It would be a much more difficult target to hit. So, Dan, it's something that we may never know. We can only speculate about. Certainly, there was speculation from the Secret Service in the White House that American Airlines Flight 77, which hit the Pentagon, was initially headed for the White House. That turned out not to be the case.
John Roberts, live with us here at Ground Zero in New York City, as our CBS News live coverage of the day that changed America goes on. If you're just joining us or rejoining us, Dan Rather with Ed Bradley in New York, watching from the pit at Ground Zero via television, the President and First Lady, as they slowly, there's no hurry here, go about offering their condolences and the condolences of the nation to the families of those who were aboard Flight 93 when it crashed in that field in Pennsylvania. Ed, this day has had several different rhythms, if you will. Started, I think, with people not quite knowing how the day might go, and then there were these very moving ceremonies here at Ground Zero and the Pentagon. Then as we reached high noon, literally, the scene shifted to Pennsylvania, and this, equally as moving as the others, has its own feel, if you will, to it.
They all have their own feel, as you say, Dan. And I'm struck here by the faces of the people, the music that we hear in the background. What struck me about what happened here at Ground Zero was the reading of the names. You know how many people were killed, and you think 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. It just goes by, it trips off the tongue. But when you sit here for 2 hours or more and hear name after name, you get a sense of how big this was and how much was lost on 9/11 last year. It's the New York Times has run these profiles of people who were killed. They ran them from just after 9/11 until the end of the year, and they've run them periodically ever since. And whenever I see another one, I just think this will never end, that they're identifying more and more people through their DNA, so they have more profiles to run of people who were killed in the World Trade Center. And hearing the names today, I had that same feeling, that this just went on and on and on. And you really had a sense of the enormity of it and the great loss that so many people felt. And not just those who lost friends and relatives and loved ones, but for all of us. I mean, Shanksville is very much, you hear this talk about America being a small town. Shanksville is a small town. 245 people live there, all the houses clustered on about 3 streets. What I saw in New York a year ago was very much New York as a small town, in a way I'd never seen it, with people in each neighborhood reaching out to friends and strangers in a way that I really hadn't seen in New York before. But you really did get the sense that New York is a small town, just as Shanksville, Pennsylvania is.
We're going to go to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Before we do so, let's just pause to soak up some of these moments in Shanksville. There is no microphone anywhere around the president, so you won't be hearing what he says in private, personally, to these families of the victims there. And now Bob Schieffer in Washington. You know, the thought occurred to me this morning as we watched the ceremonies at the Pentagon that, while it's probably true that, as Celia Farber wrote, New York is the locus of our national grief and the symbol of our resurrection, that in many ways that scar on the Pentagon was the most vivid reminder of how vulnerable we were September 11th a year ago, and how complacent we all, and that includes, unfortunately, our military and the Defense Department, how complacent we had become about the safety of the continental United States.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct, Dan, and there's a certain irony here, isn't there, in that here we have the most powerful military force in the history of the world, and the headquarters for that force, of course, is unguarded. There's no defense whatsoever around the Pentagon. I'd like to say one other thing about what's going on up there in Shanksville. Dan, I heard Ed Bradley say a while ago that because of what happened at Ground Zero and because of what happened at the Pentagon, we tend to forget what happened up there in Pennsylvania. And I think that's absolutely correct, because those were such cataclysmic events that we saw. But I'd also like to say another thing, and that is that those of us who spend our days here on Capitol Hill, the people that work here, the journalists, we'll never forget what those people did, because I remember very well on that day, I was coming up to the Capitol, which is where I work. I was at the foot of Capitol Hill. I talked to our bureau chief on the phone. I told her, I asked what the situation was, and she said, get out of there. We think there is a report of another plane headed toward Washington. And of course, that is the plane that we now know from intelligence reports was headed this way. Of course, it never got here. Those brave passengers forced it down in Pennsylvania. But everybody here on Capitol Hill knows that. I'm a grandfather, and sometimes I think every hour that I spend with my grandchildren is an hour that may have been given to me by those people on that plane in Pennsylvania. I want the people on that plane to know, and their relatives to know, I will never forget what they did that day, nor will others here on Capitol Hill, Dan.
Well, Bob, picking up on that, there's been some talk that Congress, which generally adjourns to go home and campaign in election years such as this one, that this year the Congress might stay on or be called back in special session. Perhaps the president would call them back in special session to discuss what to do about Iraq and when to do it.
I think that's very possible. In fact, I think that's likely, Dan. There is a growing feeling here, and there's going to be some disagreement on this. And when, you know, the Congress came together in the days and the hours after 9/11, they passed unanimously a $40 billion appropriation bill, illustrating and underlining that Congress, when it has to do something, can come together and do it. Now, there's been a lot of disagreement since then over various things, including how to put together a Homeland Security Department. But the president is going to ask Congress for some sort of declaration, some sort of authorization to take action against Iraq if he thinks that is necessary. As we now understand it, he's going to ask the United Nations to approve that. He wants to do it under UN auspices. But he wants some authorization to use power should it be necessary, just as the first President Bush asked the Congress to do before Desert Storm. There are some here on Capitol Hill that say it may well be better to do that after the November elections rather than do it before, to remove any sense of partisanship. I think in the end, Congress is going to do that. I think they will give the president the power that he's asking for, but it may well be they will choose to do it after the election simply because they do not want it to be part of partisan politics or seem in any way to be a partisan action. We'll know in the coming days whether that's going to happen. But if I were going to speculate at this point, I'd say that's what's going to happen.
Bob Schiefer reporting live from Capitol Hill. And no doubt some of those considerations are on the back roads of President Bush's mind today. But in the forefront of his mind, he's doing what's just in front of him now, which is offering condolences to these families of victims of the Flight 93 crash in Pennsylvania. As the president continues his rounds, we want to show you the names and faces, where we have them, of the 40 passengers and crew who died at Shanksville, as well as the 184 innocent people who died when American Flight 77 struck the Pentagon. So we now begin to show those names at the bottom of your screen. Ted Bradley, as we watch the president speak with each and every family member, you had a thought that you wanted to pass along.
Well, just looking at the names and the faces of the people who were on Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville. The book that was written called Among the Heroes, United Flight 93, pointed out that there this was not an ordinary group of passengers on that plane, that there were a number of executives used to taking charge. There were a number of, I guess you'd describe them as big guys, 6'2", 6'4", 200-pounders, athletes who were in good shape, a group of people who were, many of them described as A-type personalities. They were not people who were going to sit back and be docile. And just knowing what they knew, just mistakenly one of the hijackers, thinking that he was talking to a control tower or air traffic control, said, "We have hijacked this plane," but it went over the loudspeaker in the cabin. So everyone there knew what was going on. They got their cell phones out and used the earphones to call friends and loved ones, and they knew what had happened. They knew it was a suicide mission, because by that time people were telling them on the phone that the North Tower had been hit, the South Tower had been hit, the Pentagon had been hit, so that these poor people who were flying on that plane knew that this was a suicide mission. And they had a choice. They could sit back and do nothing, or they could try and do something. And they tried. They did something. And they gave up their lives, but those people are truly heroes.
Well, they did something. They succeeded. They succeeded in keeping the assassins from crashing the plane into the United States Capitol, which is the widespread belief now of what they intended to do, but they certainly intended to crash into something in Washington.
It was only a half hour from Washington when it crashed.
And the people on that aircraft kept them from doing that. Again, we want to pause for just a moment as the President does his duty and does it for all of us in Shanksville. CBS News has been talking with some family members of the 40 passengers and United crew members who died at Shanksville. I want to take time now to let you see their faces and hear what they have to say.
I was hoping, we knew that a plane went down in Pennsylvania, and if we finally found out it was his plane, and we were ready to go out the door. If there were any survivors, we were ready to go. And then about 5:30, we heard there were no survivors.
To this day, it's very difficult to accept what happened. It's still, the minute you get up, the second you get up in the morning, till the very last, you go to sleep at night, and 1,000 times in between, he's on our mind.
The 4 telephone calls from Tom have been like a gift to me. He told me what was going on, that he had put a plan together and that there were several of them that were going to take the airplane. And I scolded him. I said, "No, you sit down, be still, and be quiet, and don't draw attention to yourself." And he scolded me. He said, no, we're going to do something. So if they're going to crash this plane into the ground, we have to do something.
Well, I wanted America to know what a special young man he was. And he died for his country. I think he would have tried to reason with them, you know, man to man. I think he would have said to them, "Listen, I have a baby at home. I love her with all my heart, and a wife, and a mom, and brothers and sisters. And can you understand that everyone has a family? And there's no reason, you know, to kill a whole plane full of people for your cause."
I've never believed that they crashed the plane on purpose. I've always thought that they just did not have enough time, that the altitude was too low, that they were successful in getting into the cockpit, that possibly they had their hands on the yoke, but they did not have enough altitude or enough time to get the nose of the airplane up. I have always believed that, and I'll go to my grave believing that.
This plane was headed for bigger and better targets. Why did it go down in a raw place like Pennsylvania?
No question, they took the
We
plane
knew
back.
right away.
No question it was heading for Washington.
Yeah, we knew right away.
We've been told that
they were all heroes. They all had something to do.
Everybody on that plane did their part. We're
getting
sure.
that plane.
No special people. They were all very much part of it.
We said they were a unique group of people that were just put together for some reason. And maybe this was the reason.
With the training he had, I know that they fought back. It was a group of people who banded together, just like our country should now, against terrorists. You know, they were not afraid, you know, to risk their lives to fight against these terrorists.
In the beginning, we didn't watch television. We couldn't, you know, go through this a second time and see the planes and the crash site and all this. It just was a bit much. But now we just don't want 9/11 to just go away for the people that died.
I think that it's easy for people to become complacent, especially people who did not lose someone on September 11th. I mean, I think about our situation, and I have to say to you, my husband's dead. He's dead. And while that may be words to some people, that is a way of life now that the children and I are forced to live. This is a call to action for all of us, not just for the 3,000 families who lost someone that day. This is a wake-up call for each of us to step in and do the right thing, beginning with stopping terrorism.
We pause to absorb what those wonderful but still in pain people had to say as we show you pictures of President and Mrs. Bush continuing to slowly, without haste, go down the line of family members of victims of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. The President will be coming from Pennsylvania to here in New York. Then he'll be addressing the nation tonight. But before he addresses the nation tonight, CBS News 60 Minutes 2 correspondent, co-editor Scott Pelley will have a 1 hour, what we call TikTok, which is to say a recapitulation, minute by minute, hour by hour, of what happened inside the White House, inside the very top tier of the U.S. government, September 11th. Scott Pelley is with us here now. Scott?
Good morning, Dan. We interviewed the president on 2 occasions, Dan. We talked to the president in the Oval Office just last week, and we also spoke to the president on Air Force One. It was during that Air Force One interview that the president began to talk about the trip he made to New York City the week of September 11th. He went to a nearby convention center and spoke to a couple hundred family members at that time. The president was moved at the memory of that, and as I said on Air Force One, we talked about the trip that he made to see the families here in New York City.
People said to me, he'll come out, don't worry, Mr. President. We'll see him soon. I know my loved one. He'll find a place to survive underneath the rubble, and we'll get him out. I, on the other hand, have been briefed about the realities, and my job was to hug and to cry. But I remember the whole time thinking, this is incredibly sad because the loved ones won't come out.
I'm told a story, Mr. President, of a little boy who handed you a picture of his father in his firefighter uniform.
Right.
And you signed it and handed it back, and he burst into tears. Do you remember that young man?
I do. I remember a lot of young boys. When they started to get me to sign the picture, I said, your daddy won't believe that I was here, so you show him that autograph. Just trying to provide a little hope.
It's a difficult time to be with those.
It was tough, you know. I still get emotional thinking about it because we're dealing with people who loved their dads or loved their mom, loved their wives who loved their husbands. It was a tough time. You know, and it was a tough time for all of us because we were very emotional, and I was emotional at times. I felt the same now as I did then, which was sad, and I still feel sad for those who grieve for their families. But as I said, out of my tears, I see opportunity.
We never knew much about that. It was closed September 11th. The president had been scheduled to go to that meeting and spend about 30 minutes with the family members there, but it ended up taking about 2.5 hours because the president insisted on meeting and speaking with each and every person in the room.
As he's doing this afternoon, it's taking probably an hour and a half to speak with each and every family of a victim of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. Scott, I want to remind our viewers that your exclusive interview with President Bush and other members of the administration about September 11th will be on at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, 7 Central on 60 Minutes 2 tonight. But you spent a good deal of time with President Bush. What was the most revealing moment for you?
Dan, I think this is President Bush as we haven't seen him before. We saw the moments just then when he was very tearful and emotional about meeting the families. At other times in the interview, he is literally pounding his desk in anger about what happened on September 11th. I think the thing that I come away from the interview with is that the president feels as strongly about September 11th today as he did then.
Scott, we look forward to seeing the program tonight. Never before seen material in an exclusive interview with the president. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. CBS News correspondent Hattie Kaufman is in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, just outside where the president and the first lady continue giving their condolences and those of the nation to family members. Hattie?
Dan, we are kept quite a ways from where they are. I can see them, but all the cameras are kept far away except for the one that's over there, the pool camera, because this is private time. He wanted to spend private time with the families who lost those loved ones aboard that flight. You know, much has been said about the lives that could have been lost if it were not for the bravery of those on board. But I want to add another thought here, and it's not just the lives lost, but can you imagine the damage to the American psyche if another symbol went down, a symbol like the Capitol building or the White House, if it crumbled the way that the Twin Towers crumbled? We cried over what happened in New York, and I just can't even imagine the hurt that America was spared by those 40 passengers and crew members aboard United Flight 93.
Hattie Kaufman reporting live and from Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Ed Bradley is with me here at Ground Zero in New York. Ed, I know that you and almost every American knows the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who said the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Well, this is the ultimate time of challenge for this President of the United States. And yes, a time of controversy when one takes into account his determination to attack Iraq unless, as he puts it, there is a regime change there, and with what's happening with the economy. But every presidency has its test. And these moments, these days, are the test of this presidency.
And clearly, particularly on Iraq, as you mentioned, Dan, because in many ways, the president is going this alone. At least not with a lot of support from our allies, support that you would think that he wants to have, but that he may not get. He has the biggest selling job of his presidency in order to get the allies to go along with this idea of taking an active role in regime change in Iraq.
While noting that thus far there's no absolutely positive, conclusive evidence that's been made public directly linking Saddam Hussein with al-Qaeda. However, the president's point is he is trying to get his hands on nuclear as well as other weapons of mass destruction, and now is the time to move. You are watching and listening to continuing CBS News coverage of 9/11, the day that changed America. For those of you just joining us or joining us again, we're watching President Bush and the First Lady as they greet the families of those lost in the crash at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Ed, as we look forward on this day, in fact, looking forward to the next 24 hours, the president comes here to New York, the Ground Zero. He'll be speaking to the nation tonight from Ellis Island with the backdrop of the Great Lady, the Statue of Liberty. That'll be at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 8 Central. We have the president coming this afternoon here to New York. We'll be covering that, of course, live. Then we have a special edition of the CBS Evening News. Then we have 60 Minutes 2, Scott Pelley's exclusive interview with the president and other exclusive material beginning at 8, 7 Central. Then the president speaking at 9. And then tomorrow morning, not only does the scene shift, but the emphasis shifts. The president comes to the United Nations to, there's every indication, lay it on the line. It's going to be an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein to get the United Nations to issue an ultimatum. Is there any doubt, as you travel around the country, any doubt in people's mind that we are going to strike Iraq? It's only a matter of time.
You know, even among people who say, I hope we don't do this, I hear them saying, I think that we are. And I've heard people say, how do we not make this happen? People who are opposed to an attack against Iraq. But we certainly seem to be headed down that road. And what's interesting is that some of the top-ranking members of the president's own party have said, show us the evidence, make the case why we should go in after this man. Show us how he is directly connected to 9/11. Yes, we know that he has weapons of mass destruction. Yes, we know that he has used them before. I was in northern Iraq and saw what he had done to the Kurdish people. And we went in through Turkey and talked to people who said that they saw their friends and neighbors and relatives just drop because of the poison gas that had been used in Halabja and in those areas around Halabja. So we know that he will use these weapons. He's used them against his own people. But there are some people who say, is he crazy enough to strike out outside of his own boundaries, outside of the country that he controls? As someone said, you know, we don't want a mushroom cloud to be the smoking gun. Show me the smoking gun, but we don't want the mushroom cloud to be that smoking gun. The president is in a very difficult position. He has a tough selling job, not only to the members of his own party who are doubtful, but to a significant number of Americans who are concerned about this track that he seems to be on. And then with a number of allies around the country. I mean, he seems to have Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, on the train with him. But there are very few passengers among our allies who are on this train that President Bush seems to have set in motion.
As I say, the focus shifts to that dramatically tomorrow morning with the president's speech to the United Nations here in New York, which we, of course, at CBS News will carry live on these CBS News stations. And right now, the president is continuing doing what he feels he must do, he should do, and he wants to do in Pennsylvania. As he goes about that work, that duty with the First Lady, thought comes to mind that it's clear the president has decided that he doesn't have to make a case directly linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. That his case is, listen, once we got into this war, it's not a war we wanted. Once we got into this war, I said it was going to be long, said it was going to be difficult, and we will move against terrorism in whatever form, and he views Saddam Hussein as a kind of ultimate terrorist. Now, for some of you, your local news will be next on this CBS station. For the rest of you, our coverage will roll on. I hope you noted that we have put at the bottom of the screen the names and photographs now of not only those who died in New York, but also those who died at the Pentagon and at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. CBS News coverage of 9/11, the day that changed America, will continue.